Hey guys, so this video is gonna be about how I optimize my graphics settings for Rise of the Tomb Raider while recording high quality gameplay at 2560 by 1080 with an average FPS of 60 on my GTX 1060, the 3GB version, with a 5-year-old processor, my Intel i7-4790. So if you have a somewhat similar build, don't lose hope. You can still game at 1080p with an average of 60 FPS and upload good quality videos to share with everyone. Now for Rise of the Tomb Raider, you have two options to play around with. You have the display options and the graphics options. So for display options, you have brightness, DirectX 12, full screen and exclusive full screen, and you have your resolutions, your refresh rate, anti-aliasing, VSync, and stereoscopic 3D. So what's important here for me is DirectX 12, the two full screen modes, the resolution, refresh rate, and anti-aliasing most especially, and VSync. So let's start with DirectX 12. Usually I set it off because every time I set it on, the game does run smoother, but at certain cutscenes in the game, some elements would just flicker, and I don't like that. So I set it off, and it never happened again, so I just keep it at that. So with full screen, I have full screen on and exclusive full screen off. The reason why is because actually full screen is not the true full screen, because it's just windowed full screen, and exclusive full screen is actually the real one. Every time I play to record videos, I set this off because I have to minimize my game, go to OBS, check on YouTube, open Sony Vegas and whatnot. So exclusive full screen is turned on if I just play for fun. Like I just want to play, I don't want to record, because switching to different windows and different programs having exclusive full screen on is very annoying because it takes more time to load. So keep that in mind when you're setting this up. Another thing is resolution. So for resolution, I just keep mine at the native resolution of my monitor, which is 2560 by 1080. Anything lower than that, it sucks because it makes the game look fuzzy. And if my game doesn't look that good, my videos won't look that good. So yeah, I just leave it at the 2560 by 1080. And my monitor's refresh rate is 60, so I just leave it at 60. And anti-aliasing. So this guy actually has a very huge impact on FPS and performance. So setting this, I set anti-aliasing at FXAA only, so it's the lowest setting, because having it off, I don't really like having the obvious jagged edges of graphics. So I can set it up to SMAA, but I get a 5 FPS drop on average, and the higher I go, the more FPS goes down. So I set it at FXAA. That looks good enough for me. And VSync. The thing about VSync is, in Rise of the Tomb Raider, I don't usually get that much screen tearing. So initially I set it to off, and then I started playing with VSync a bit, and then I noticed that if I go triple buffered, it actually makes the game look like it's running smoother, in my opinion, because like if I'm playing competitive games like PUBG, CSGO, and fast-paced games like that, when you're usually up against other people, I use VSync off to eliminate input lag. But with Tomb Raider games, triple buffered makes the game run smoother, and input lag doesn't really affect me that much because you're up against AI. So yeah. And now let's go to graphics. So the things I adjust the most here on graphics, which for me, in my experience, are the ones that have the greatest impact on FPS, are texture and ambient occlusion sometimes, level of detail. Yeah, that's it. And other settings are basically just preference on how you want your game to look. So for texture quality, I go with high. That's as high as I can go while maintaining a decent FPS while gaming and recording at the same time. And anisotropic filtering, this is interesting because it actually has a big impact on how your game looks, but it doesn't really affect my system performance that much, so I take advantage of that. I also saw on other videos on YouTube that if you set anisotropic filtering, so you're gonna either want to go with trilinear, or you might as well go up to 16x, because I think 16x and 2x doesn't really make that much of a difference for me unless you're gaming on 4K resolution, I think, because I don't know, at 1080p or maybe sometimes recording at 1080p, people won't usually notice the difference between 2x and 16x, so I just go with 16x. Now with shadow quality, I go very high because it doesn't really do much to my FPS. I notice that if I go to the lowest setting, the shadows appear jagged and fake. So I don't like that. It makes the videos look bad. It makes the videos look really bad. So next is Sunsoft Shadows. So what this does is it makes the quality of shadows cast by the sun or any light source in the game smoother and more realistic. So having Sunsoft Shadows on is always good for me. Now ambient occlusion is another thing though. So it has the VXAO as highest and HBAO plus after that, and then you just have on and off. So the setting that I go for ambient occlusion is HBAO plus because it's the highest that I can go, where I can still record 60 FPS videos at 1080p. If I go any higher, it would just suck. Now for depth of field, I use very high. And the level of detail is actually, this is where it gets interesting, because increasing the level of detail actually makes distant objects render in sooner. I think adds in more elements to the game that take up memory. So the sweet spot for me is having texture quality only on high, but level of detail on very high. I can go with just high level of detail. Now for tessellation, of course I have it on. Screen space reflections on as well. Now for specular reflections quality, I used to set it on high, but recently I tried going very high and the game just looks stunning. Reflections on the water, on the skin, on the rocks, it looks better, most especially on the reflections on ice. Dynamic foliage is also important in Rise of the Tomb Raider, or basically in Tomb Raider games, because in my opinion this is one of the unique features of the game for having great quality foliage. So having it on high for me is a must, and I'm willing to sacrifice other settings, but dynamic foliage is just set to high for me. Bloom I have on. For vignette blur, I turn this off because playing on ultrawide you see more of the things around you. So if I enable vignette blur, it's a bit annoying because you already have that high field of view with that slight fisheye effect, and having the sides of your screen blurred out a bit is just too noticeable for me. So I just set this off. And motion blur, oh yes, motion blur. Other people might disagree that they hate motion blur, but sincerely I love motion blur. I just think that it makes the game look more cinematic. This is a casual game, so it's a very cinematic game also. The cutscenes are great, the visuals are great, so having motion blur in there is a plus for me and also a plus for my videos. Oh, and also pure hair. I have pure hair set to on because the difference between off and on is just night and day. Like pure hair off, Lara's hair just looks like shit. So there's no way that I'm gonna play the game with that. But I noticed that if I set it on very high, I get a little bit of FPS drop, like maybe 3 to 5. So, and lens flare, screen effects, and fill grain. By the way, the last few settings in graphics are purely preference. For lens flares, yeah, I like lens flares. They're great. Screen effects, these are the effects that you see when you're, for example, you get blood splatter on your screen, you have water on the screen after you go swimming. It adds a feeling of immersion in the game, so I have that on. But I disable film grain because the overall quality just looks a bit noisy for me. So yeah, I just set film grain off. Yeah, so these are the settings that I go with. So hope you guys learned from that, and I'll see you next time.